In today's video, we're doing an introduction into MEWPs. What are they? How do you manage them? What do you need to think of? Let's go. What's up peeps, welcome back to Rebranding Safety. Rebranding Safety is the YouTube channel and podcast doing exactly what it says on the tin. We're here to change the perception of health and safety. We do that right here. So hit that subscribe button and the bell and all those magical algorithm thingamajigs. Okay, let's get into it. Mobile elevated work platforms. What the bloody hell does that mean? It's a really complicated way to say scissor lifts, cherry pickers, boom lifts, things like that basically. Things that lift people from the floor up to the air, e.g. elevated working platform. Before we get into any more about it though, just a quick shout out to Paradigm Human Performance, the official sponsor of Rebranding Safety YouTube and podcast. So thank you very much Paradigm. I'll talk some more about them later when we get into the kind of human factors tips for managing MEWPs. Okay, so what are the legal requirements when it comes to working with an MEWP? Let's nail that out of the way with first so we can actually get down to managing the risk and actually cracking on with the work. So the primary piece of legislation that's going to impact your work on MEWPs, mobile elevated working platforms, is going to be the working at height regs. So the important thing with the working at height regs in Regulation 6 that it lays out a quite clear and legally binding hierarchy for you to go through when managing work at height. So you've got to prioritise avoiding work at height where reasonably practicable by doing other tasks or anything like that. You've got to show that you've considered that first. And then if it's not reasonably practicable to not work at height, e.g. you must work at height, then you must have shown how you've prevented a fall by using equipment or other mitigating measures to prevent a fall. And then again, if that's not reasonably practicable, you must take reasonable and practicable steps to reduce the likelihood of injury. So a simple way to describe this would be to reduce the distance in which somebody would fall, or to reduce the consequences of somebody falling. So for example, you might have those kind of crash pads that they use in the movies and stuff. Okay, working on MEWP is also going to be applicable to CDM, Construction Design Management Regulations. It's also, because it's a piece of work equipment, it's going to be applicable to PURE, the Provision and Use of Work Equipment Regulations. And because it's a lifting operation, lifting equipment, it's going to be applicable under LOLA, the Lifting Operations and Lifting Equipment Regulations as well. LOLA is going to bring specific requirements for you to do a thorough inspection, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so checks and inspections then. In this type of work, a pre-use check is going to be vital, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them towards the end of the video when we talk about the human factors tools that you can implement in this type of work. You're going to want a pre-use daily check, however you want to work it, you're going to want a pre-use check on this MEWP before you get on it. And not just that, but all the other equipment that you use, such as PPE or anything else, your tools as well. And the best advice here would be to check the manufacturer's log and make sure that you're doing the checks that the manufacturer advises you to do. But as I mentioned a minute ago, there's a requirement to have a thorough inspection under the Lifting Operations and Lifting Equipment Regulations. This is actually called a thorough examination, and it's normally done by an insurance engineer, and it's required 6 monthly because you're lifting a human. Okay, so now we're on to assessing and managing the risk. So just some things to bear in mind when you're assessing and dealing with the risk of working at height in an MEWP. What type of work are you actually doing, and what is the best MEWP for it? So for example, where the base of the MEWP is going to be is actually quite a distance away from where you need to work, then it's going to be a cherry picker. The size and the scale of these is going to vary on the type of work you need to do. So you need to get very clear on what work actually needs to be done. It's important to highlight when in that work process, because it's normally part of a wider project, do you need the MEWP? Bearing in mind that the working at height regulations legally require you to avoid working at height as much as possible. You're going to need to think about the general area for a couple of reasons. Getting the MEWP on site and into that location, but also the ground surface, the substrate, and the anchorage of that MEWP is the floor. So bear that in mind. Is the ground soft? Have you got room to put out the kind of anchorage legs that you can get on some of these as well? If you're working inside a property, you might even need to consider the strength of the floor. Consider overhead obstructions. So things like overhead cabling, things like if you're raising up the MEWP, is the person going to get crushed, likely to maybe be crushed between the MEWP and the roof of the building, for example. If there's something above their head, that's likely going to instigate you needing a hard hat. Think about the SWL, the safe working load for the MEWP. This is normally printed printed on the device and in the documentation it will come with the MEWP as well. And that's going to tell you how much weight that can take, e.g. number of people and tools and equipment and supplies and so on and so forth. Think about whether the MEWP needs to be moved when you're doing the work. This is a very common issue where people move the MEWP whilst they're at height, and have a think about if you can or cannot do that. Some will come with the controls in the cab so you can move it at height. If you're doing that, then where's the route? And understand that when you're moving an item at height, that's like, for example, a scissor lift, you know, the movement down at the bottom is going to be slight, but the movement at the top is going to be really big. So a lot of companies normally go down the route of just saying no. And that might be taken out of your control, the MEWP that you hire or have or buy or whatever. They might not even have that designed into it. Think about the other people in the working area. What's the traffic like? Are the people walking around, are dropping tools, or people going to crash into your MEWP? Think about the working environment. What else is going on? Don't be narrow-minded and just focusing on your work. Focus on everything else around as well. Try and think of it as a system. Loads of different things are going on. What parts of the system are going to interact with that MEWP? Another important thing to think about, is especially if you're working outside, I touched on it earlier, is the weather conditions. A slight increase in the wind can really have a massive implication when you're working at some serious height in an MEWP. Like I said, what will feel like a tiny breeze down on the ground will be massive at the top. If you're going to say that don't work when it's windy, you need to define what windy is. And that might depend on the risk, it might depend on the environment. So you might just say, use your general kind of feeling. Does it feel windy? And when you're up there, just go, actually, no, it's too windy, I'm going to come down. Therefore, you probably need to dictate what is too windy and how do they measure that. This means around planning the work, giving the person enough time to be able to say, we can't do the work today. So don't be working at height, serious high risk work. Don't be doing this when your deadline to get it done is tomorrow. You need to build yourself in some capacity for the weather to change, for something to go wrong. If you're putting pressure on that person to make a decision, they might be forced to work at height when actually the weather's not great. Which brings us really nicely onto the human factors stuff. Thank you very much Paradigm Human Performance for sponsoring this video, and more specifically the HSE subscription service. Paradigm's Human Performance HSE subscription service is the perfect solution for those small and medium-sized enterprises, those companies out there that are spinning all the plates and sometimes safety might just fall by the wayside. This is the perfect subscription service to build a partnership with a company that are experts in this, which are going to help you get your industry and regulatory compliance all nailed down. It's going to do that whilst at the same time it's going to help you put worker safety at the center, the DNA of your organization. It's going to help you utilize the subject matter expertise of your employees. This is not your off-the-shelf compliance system. This is not something you're going to need to declutter when you've learned about new view and human factors and stuff like that. This has got it already woven in throughout it. So if this sounds like the right option for you, you can contact Paradigm via the email address or the phone number in the description below. But if you're still not sure, go and check Paradigm out on their website, which is linked in the description below, and sign up for the Learning Organisation webinar. It's a great resource with great educational content, and the best thing is once you've signed up, you can get access to all the backlog as well. Okay, so some things to consider from a human factors point of view. We've kind of touched on it, but remember that work is complex and work deviates. Weathers will change, pressures will change, attention spans will change, and consider people's mindset when they're in this type of work. So in human and organisational performance, it's very common that we break people's mindsets down into three categories. You've got knowledge base, which are people that are brand new, they're learning, they're in knowledge mode, they're learning, they're absorbing stuff, and these people are going to be really kind of focusing on process and procedures. They're going to ask a lot of questions, they're going to make mistakes, but they're actually going to make more than likely the small mistakes, because they're not going to make big decisions. They're going to ask for a lot of help. They're going to check things, they're going to sense check a lot of the time. You're also going to have rules-based. Rules-based is probably where these people are going to be, especially if this is a new task. So the best way to describe rules-based would be you're a competent driver, you've been driving for a long time, but now you're driving in a country where you're driving on a different side of the road, for example. So you're like, oh, I know how to drive, but this is a little bit different. So you're really aware of the rules and you're just following the rules. And then you've got skills-based. Skills-based are people that have built the skills, they've got it, they've nailed it down, and they are just cracking on with the job. So the risk here comes with complacency and kind of overconfidence and things like that. So be aware of the mindset that these people might be in. Is this a routine task and people have been doing it for years and years and years and they might fall into that complacency? Or is this a brand new task and they're not really sure? So they're gonna need a lot of guidance and a lot of support. Understanding their mindset is going to be really, really helpful for you to manage that risk and plan to fail safely. One other thing for me would be the point of no return. So understanding the point of no return in this work would be really, really helpful, because once you've done that point of no return, e.g. the button when you're elevated, or for example, point of no return would be somebody putting their foot on the barrier to lean over and do some work to paint the side or whatever it is they're doing. That point of no return is when they lean, for example. So try to highlight the point of no return within that work, because once you've done that, you can start to work backwards and put in these kind of human performance tools in, these kind of critical control points. So for example, a buddy check. Remember we said earlier about having a harness and a lanyard. Having a buddy check them over, give them a good shake and kind of tap each other on the back and have a look over it, and then you come and look at mine. Yep, looks all good, lanyard looks good. So I've checked mine, but I want my buddy to check mine as well. Okay, finally is the thing that a lot of people seem to overlook, is emergency planning. You need to make sure that if something goes wrong, you've got a plan. We're talking about some serious work here. Working at height is the biggest contributor to fatal injuries at work in the UK. Just simple things is that you're going to want people that are trained and competent to lower the basket down. 9 times out of 10, your MEWP will have a control on the ground floor, be it hydraulic. You don't want one that's electric. They might have one that's electric as well, but you need a backup, because if the power cuts out, the fuel runs out, whatever it is, you're going to need something that can bring it down manually. So where is that? Do you know where it is? Do you know how to use it? Are they trained how to use it? And so on and so forth. Simple stuff like that. When it comes to emergency planning, I like to ask 3 questions. First, what's the worst that can happen? Then you need to plan for that. Don't run your emergency planning on likelihood, because big accidents are not very likely. But normally when they do happen, we've gone, oh, we didn't plan for that because it wasn't very likely. So for example, if you've got a restriction lanyard on and you're like, I'm not going to plan for him falling out of the cab because he's got his restriction lanyard on. But what if he did? How are you going to save that lady or that guy that's hanging out of that cab? I've been in this kind of situation where I've asked someone to wear a harness and a lanyard when they're in an MEWP, and they're like, why? I've got this barrier around me. It's kind of like a stack of dominoes, which means you don't have much flexibility. For example, if you kind of misjudge the weather and it's a bit windier than you thought and the MEWP starts waving, something goes wrong there, you start to lose your balance. So that's the second thing that's gone wrong. And then you go over the edge, you're dead. There's no, you know, if you're working at serious height here, that's it. This is a fatal accident. So for me, it's about building capacity to fail safe. Plan for things that could go wrong, don't write them off. Obviously you don't want to plan for every single scenario, so you need to consider likelihood, but don't let likelihood lead the decision. Let severity lead the decision. Just ask the question, play devil's advocate with yourself. But if they did fall out of that cab, if they did lean over the side, if they did have a heart attack, how would we know? Which brings us on to the next thing. How will you know? How quick will you find out if something went wrong? So if you've got working at height and lone working together, you've got a problem. How quick are you going to find out if someone went wrong with that person? You might be able to implement a device, for example, if you have to have lone working. I would not advise lone working with serious working at height, but ultimately sometimes you can't avoid it. How quick will you know? And then once you work out how you'll know and how quick you'll know, next is how quick can you react? So for example, if you've got a fall arrest system and you're not doing a restriction system, so e.g. someone falls and they've been arrested at height, then they're now hanging and they can suffer from suspension trauma and so on and so forth. So how quick you react is really, really important. If the weather changes in an instant, you need to react really quick. If the power cuts out, you need to react pretty quickly. You don't want to leave them up there for hours and hours. So how quick can you react? If something's going to go wrong, how soon will you know, and how quick can you react? Okay, I hope this video has been useful. If it had, hit the like button and all of that stuff. Don't forget to check out Paradigm, and otherwise I'll catch you next week. Safe.